For part 2 of this lecture, I want to shift gears a little bit and dive specifically into Alaska Native spirituality, and specifically how sacred traditions have shifted or stayed the same or been transitioned away from in the wake of the rise of Christianity, which was, of course, introduced into Alaska in the mid-1700s, starting with Russian Orthodox priests, and then later with Protestant missionaries and others operating in the 1800s, mid to late 1800s, and then into the 1900s. As I talk about that, I want to reshare something I've shared before, which is again that concept of the peoplehood matrix. You'll recall that according to this theory, a fundamental part of traditional indigenous people's sense of identity of their specific people, be that Dene, be that Hopi, be that Denaina, would have been a ceremonial cycle of some sort or some types of religious or spiritual tradition that the group had in common. Clifford Geertz, famous anthropologist, says that religion causes people to have views about the world and feelings about the world that they regard as the really real, right? So for some cultures, it's kind of the bedrock for how they view the world. For other cultures, it's not very important, but for many Native cultures, it was and is. And so the question then becomes, what becomes of these cultures when the traditional spirituality, so core, has shifted, when so many people have converted to Christianity? And it would be easy for people to say, oh, just like a displacement, right? Like Christianity just moves in and therefore other things move out. The reality on the ground is, yeah, sort of, but also a lot more complicated than that and a lot different than that. And there's other kinds of continuities as well. So for example, the Eklutna spirit houses that we've talked about and read about. Within the community of Eklutna, but we also see this in some other Athabascan communities as well around Canada and Alaska, but particularly Eklutna is a very good example of this. You have an interesting fusion of Russian Orthodoxy and Denaina practices about the dead. Of course, helping the dead to transition to the next life is a really widespread theme in many different cultural and religious traditions. Indeed, many anthropologists consider when we see practices of honoring the dead in the archaeological record to be our first evidence of religion. I don't really buy that argument because I think people honor the dead whether they're religious or not, but the point is honoring the dead oftentimes does have deeply religious overtones. And it's interesting though, traditionally in Denaina communities you would have had cremation, and that was a way of helping the departed move on to the next stage and not sort of have a spirit dwelling about, and that would be not good for anybody, for the community or for their lost ancestor, right? Allow them to continue that cycle within which life continues. In Russian Orthodoxy, when I don't know the reason for this, I am not enough of an expert on Eastern Orthodoxy, but the priests indicated they taught against cremation and taught that this was inappropriate. And I don't know if that's a Russian Orthodox teaching in general or just of the specific priests we had here in Alaska. So if somebody's more familiar with it, I'd love to hear it. I know that there are definitely Christian traditions where cremation is kind of frowned upon, partly viewed as sort of a sacrilege to the dead. Other traditions practice cremation very willingly. So Russian Orthodoxy moves into the area, and people are told, we don't do that anymore, we don't cremate, that's not appropriate now for you as Christians. And so instead though, but people still had the sense of spirits that could cause issues if not properly resolved their status. And so now instead of if you can't send them along through burning the bones or through burning the body, and if you're burying them, and therefore sort of keeping them around, the spirits, people instead make these spirit houses, right? These structures over the grave. This is not a spirit house, this is a church. But these structures over the grave, which in a sense can act to house or hold the spirits of the deceased so that they don't become sort of out of place, to use Mary Douglas's old phrase, and causing challenges for the community. It's an interesting fusion of concepts. It's a really interesting fusion of concepts. Keep that in mind as we talk about a few things. So keep that in mind as we talk about the religious demographics of Alaska Native people, that even as we see a large shift to Christianity historically, that doesn't mean that traditional beliefs are not still influencing things, as we saw with the spirit houses. But when we look at Alaska Native groups in general, this data is a few years old, but approximately 80% Christian, less than 5% other world religions, so again, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, Judaism, Taoism, and about 17% unaffiliated. So the percentage of Christian is higher, quite a bit higher, about 20% higher than the rest of Alaska, which is really interesting. They also have a much lower percentage of people that don't identify as a religion, so from 30% to 15%, which is actually really interesting. So it's interesting that you don't just have like vast swaths of people saying no religion, since, you know, typically in a survey you may or may not have an option of identifying as a specific Alaska Native practice, right, of like, let's say, Yupik spirituality and healing. And so it's interesting that you don't have a larger percentage of unaffiliated people claiming that identity, and instead 80% of people, 4 out of 5, that feel comfortable saying, yeah, I'm Christian, to us, at least in a survey. How it breaks out is like this. So here's just kind of, this matches the population as a whole. This is about double or almost triple the population as a whole of Russian Orthodoxy. So in many Russian Orthodox communities across Alaska, Native people are a very strong presence of the local congregations, of the local church communities. Among about 50% of Alaska Native people identify as one of the Protestant traditions, broken out fairly evenly between evangelical Christian and some of the other Protestant mainline, quote-unquote, Protestant groups, such as United Methodist Church, for example. But as we look at that, it's important again to bring in mind syncretism, right? So as with the Eklutna spirit houses, so with some of the other examples we'll share, religions often blend, and when they blend a whole lot, we call that syncretism, when the result is a blending. And, you know, we sometimes think of syncretism as sort of the exception, right? Religions usually kind of stick in their lane, and then every once in a while they blend in interesting ways, such as Vodou and the ways that it blends Catholicism and Yoruba religious practices, arguably. But syncretism, instead of viewing it as the exception and something only certain religions do among certain groups, which sometimes has colonial overtones, instead we should see syncretism as something that religions do, period. This is something that has been happening for as long as we have religions, it would appear. You look at Tibetan Buddhism and you definitely see the evidences of mixing between Buddhism and Tibetan practices, including Bon. So the Buddhism practiced by the Dalai Lama has syncretic influences, right? Christianity had influences, early Christianity had influences from Greek philosophy, Roman philosophy. You know, Christian holidays sometimes intermixed with local pre-Christian or pagan European holidays, right? So solstices, among other things. And so religions have been blending together really for a very long time. That's part of what religion is, and it doesn't mean that people don't sincerely believe in their religion. I think it's a testimony to the power of culture and ancestors and community that people continue to draw heavily on their own traditions, and often in ways where the local tradition and the new world religion blend oftentimes around things that either they have in common or that resonate, points of agreement or at least points of resonance. So you see this with Yupik practices of Russian Orthodoxy. As was talked about in the video last week, Great Blessing on the Water, there are many examples of this. The traditional Yupik practice of saying a prayer of gratitude for the first salmon, also practiced by Dena'ina people, has now been Christianized, right? Where people, some fishers still definitely do this, pray over the first salmon caught, but instead pray to God in the Abrahamic or Christian sense. You have also a strong emphasis on the sacredness of water. You know, in general, many Christians believe that the world is a sacred creation from God, but a special emphasis on water as sacredness. Within the Russian Orthodox Church, people putting a strong emphasis on the blessing on the water, which is something done to, as I understand it, consecrate holy water. It's done on the day of the Theophany. I think that would be the day that marks when Jesus was baptized and God the Father speaks from the heavens and the Holy Ghost appears as a dove. So it's an important site within, or it's an important date within Christianity, and some Christian churches honor it in their liturgy, in their calendar. So here there's a ceremony that's done and it blesses water. Ice is taken up, in this case as a cross, and then people do a prayer over it or put a crucifix over it and bless the water. The priest blesses the water and it becomes holy. And you'll then have people like using it for healing and things. Like people will say, you know, had a really bad rash, couldn't get to the doctor, used that water and it helped me, it cleared it right up. And so a strong emphasis on holy water, which, yeah, definitely that's something out of Russian Orthodoxy, but the perhaps a stronger emphasis than you would usually see. Alan Boris thought, and I think he's right, that reflected Yupik and Denina ideas about water as sacred that are then sort of feeding into how Russian Orthodoxy is thought of and practiced in these communities. This should really say Yupik and Denina Orthodoxy. Out in Bristol Bay region, you have both groups of people and both doing some of these different customs. So then what happens to the old traditional ways, things since time immemorial, in the wake of mass conversions of large percentages of the population in the 1800s and 1900s? The answer is then, it's not as simple as total rejection, which obviously isn't what happened, or total conversion, but a lot of times we see syncretism, or we sometimes say hybridity, two things mixing together and making something new, or localization. You know, the new religion does take hold, but it's kind of giving local spins or local flavors. Now, one kind of thing to bring up with Christianization of Alaska Native communities, and it's a tough topic, and it's one I hope I do well, and I hope I do respectfully. People are sometimes, predominantly non-Native scholars or audiences, are sometimes have raised the question of how is it that people come to identify with or adopt a religion that originally came from a colonizing force, right? Christianity originally came through Russian Empire and later the US groups, which, while not typically using military to actively expand, nonetheless had sort of a hierarchical relationship here, right? Where it was the new country announcing that they owned these territories, even though these territories had not consented to it. So how is it then that people come to adopt a religion of a colonizing group? It's complex. There's a lot of complexities to it. But much like syncretism, this is nothing new. This has been happening for a very long time in many parts of the world. But the other answer is it's very diverse how it happens. So one thing is that there was early Russian Orthodox presence very early on. It was not the motivating force for colonialism. That was the fur trade. But within about 50 years, you started to see Russian Orthodox priests in Cook Inlet. Oftentimes they, more than their trading co-Russians, is that a word? Co-Russians? You know what I'm saying? People from the same country. Unlike a lot of other Russians, a lot of times the priests made more of an effort to learn the local language, to talk to local people, using that, and to better understand practices and things like that. And so that's, I think, one of the reasons is that Russian Orthodox priests were potentially seen not quite as the colonizers to the same degree that some of the fur traders would have been, that there was differences in how different Russians were perceived. And indeed, it was sometimes priests that were directly criticizing the traders, writing back to the Tsar and things about the human rights abuses of fur traders. I'm not trying to suggest that priests were perfect or that there weren't priests also engaging in human rights abuses, but I think we see in the historical records Russian Orthodox priests coming across a lot differently to local communities typically than the traders sometimes did. Obviously, sometimes it was just that people were persuaded, right, that they found the new religious system meaningful and wanted to convert, that they found it true or meaningful, the same way people convert generally to things. Another factor was the complexity, was the what I'll call social trauma, or I put here cultural chaos and cultural reconfiguration. So there are a number of epidemics, as you know, swept through Cook Inlet region and broader Alaska in the mid-1800s and early 1900s. The smallpox epidemic of 1835, influenza and measles around the turn of the century, the influenza epidemic of the flu epidemic of 1918. So you have different epidemics, and many of these took out and killed vast swaths of people. Some communities saw like 50% declines, such as some Yupik communities, the Dena'ina communities in Kenai Peninsula, right? 50% of people within a generation or two, or sometimes within a few years, in the case of the Kenai Peninsula smallpox epidemic. I don't think we can even begin to comprehend what that is like to have lost half of the people in your country. And so that is a situation then where people are in chaos, people are in trauma, people are looking for answers. And it's not shocking, and we've seen many times in the history of the world, that people in chaos and trauma sometimes adopt new religious traditions or new versions of old religious traditions as they seek to find meaning and find answers. Also, potentially, if other traditions had not worked in the way they wanted them to. We'll come back to that in a minute. The Comity Agreement of 1908 was an agreement between several Christian denominations to essentially split Alaska into multiple pieces of which missionaries would go to which areas, which denominations' missionaries would go to which areas. Alaska's huge, and from the perspective of these denominations, even though they had differences, sort of why reinvent the wheel and try to be converting people to Christianity in the same community, instead we'll go to different areas. So you had Episcopalian people as a strong missionary force in the Yukon Delta, Yupik people. Presbyterian is a very strong force in Southeast Alaska. A lot of missionaries, as well as boarding schools run by Presbyterians, and indeed, the Alaska Native Brotherhood and Sisterhood, many of the people that helped found that were from Presbyterian boarding schools and were active Presbyterians as they were doing Native organizing. And that's one of the reasons why that group had more of a semi-assimilationist tendency of sometimes of sort of moving away from certain parts of the traditions and assimilating into certain parts of broader Alaskan societies. Kodiak and Cook Inlet was to be preached to by Baptist groups and Methodists into the Aleutian Islands. This is one reason why you sometimes see some communities among Alaska Native groups have like a large percentage of Presbyterians, for example. There's also like individual things too, like specific communities that aren't covered under these big umbrellas. And so, for example, there's a part of Yupik area, which I was talking to one of our students about, or rather they were sharing with me, and then it was something I went and did more research on, where you have a lot of presence of Society of Friends, more popularly known as Quaker. So you had Quaker missionaries in a specific couple of towns there, and so you have to this day a very high percentage of Quakers of Society of Friends. Similarly, down on the Metlakatla Reservation, our one and only true reservation, quote unquote, in Alaska, you have people who are the split apart from other Tsimshian communities as a result of the preaching of an Anglican priest whose name I'm forgetting, or rather an Anglican lay leader who had his own very interesting ideas about Anglicanism and ended up breaking I don't know if kicked out is the right word, but they broke association. So he then kind of had his own branch of his views of Anglicanism. And so you have these like specific influences on different towns. There's an interesting book, a great book but can also be a hard book to read, by Harold Napoleon called Yurak, The Way of the Human Being. He talks about traditional Yupik spirituality. He talks about, for example, the idea of Yurak, the way of the human being. He says, Yurak defined the correct way of thinking and speaking about all living things, especially the great sea and land mammals on which the Yupik relied for food, clothing, shelter, tools, kayaks. These great creatures were sensitive. They were able to understand human conversations, and they demanded and received respect. Yurak prescribed the correct method of hunting and fishing and the correct way of handling all fishing game caught by the hunter in order to honor and appease these spirits and maintain a harmonious relationship. So the idea of a world sort of full of Inruk, of spirit or breath, of many entities with spirit, and that you needed to be right with them and follow the right protocols, and that there were many specific things you needed to do to be right with them. Key to those efforts was a type of person called an Angokuk. We could translate that as shaman, but they were also healers and leaders. He called them the village historians, physicians, judges, arbitrators, and interpreters. He also says, to the Yupik, the world visible to the eye and available to the senses showed only one aspect. Unseen was the spirit world. just as important as the visible, if not more so, was lived in deference to this world. Yupik life was lived in deference to this world and the spirit beings that inhabited. And as he points out, a lot of missionaries and travelers saw these Yupik ceremonies, saw ceremonies designed to appease spirits that might sometimes be harmful to you, and viewed it as devil worship, which was a natural enough interpretation, I suppose, from their perspective, but their perspective was one clearly that was being very ethnocentric, that was interpreting, by which I mean that it was interpreting it according to their lens, right? That would be something that would make sense in their lens to attribute a separate spirit as a devil, whereas from local Yupik people's lenses, that would not have made sense, right? So two different cultural worldviews of the same ceremony being observed or the same phenomena being addressed. And it's not my place as an anthropologist to say who's right, but to note the difference. Napoleon's ideas about these sorts of about this world full of spirits that could be interacted with shows up in a variety of Yupik stories. One rather well-known Yupik story is The Boy Who Went to Live with the Seals. This version is recorded by Anne Fiona Briorden, who was told it by John Paul, and is in her book Boundaries and Passages. He says, "A long time ago, there was a couple who wanted their only son to become a great hunter. They permitted a powerful shaman to send the boy to live for a year with the seals. At the close of the annual Bladder Festival," which is one of the ceremonies that the settlers misunderstood, "the shaman took the boy to the ice hole and let him depart with the seal bladders, returning to their home under the sea. There, the boy stayed in the seals' kazkik, communal men's house, where an adult bearded seal hosted him and taught him to view the human world from the seal's point of view. He would look up through the skylight, seeing the people from his village as the seals saw him. He observed whether they were acting properly, shoveling doorways, clearing ice holes, and generally making a way for the seals to enter the human world. For example, when he heard snow hit the undersea sky." So we just had a weird time warp because you all perceived that just a couple of seconds have passed in this video, but I was actually gone for we just had a weird time loop because you all perceived that just like a couple of hours have passed, but actually for me, subjectively, it was like I was gone for like 4 or 5 hours. I had to go do some stuff, but anyways, so to finish out what I was saying though, in The Boy Who Went to Live with the Seals, in that story, you have, it says, where were we? Well, staying with the seals. Okay. "The boy's parents would sometimes miss him very much. During the year of his absence, the shaman would tell them to make akutak, literally a mixture, and let the shaman eat. When the parents gave akutak to the shaman, the boy received akutak in the seal world." So we see these themes, right? We have these themes from traditional Yupik spirituality, including the idea that shamans, angotuk, can interact with the spirit world, in this case send material to the spirit world, or rather in this case not the spirit world, but the seal world, a world of spirits, but one that is very much part of our physical world, but where they are living much further down in the sea below the ice. It makes one think of a concept from anthropology called perspectivism. There's a classic paper by Viveros de Castro about this. He talks about Amazonian indigenous groups where, Eduardo Cohn talks about this too, but where there's societies where, from their perspective, jaguars see humans the way humans see other animals. So like humans are prey to jaguars, and jaguars like have their own villages, right? And in this case, seals, right? They, maybe village is the wrong word, but they're definitely there, hanging out as a community, watching what the humans are up to, right? And the boy who goes to the seal is able to see this and see how they observe them and see if they're sort of making things on the ice and in the community in a way that they can come up onto the ice, as seals are wont to do. In the spring, the boy swam through the ocean with his host, viewing human hunters. After encountering a number of unworthy hunters, he and his host approached a good hunter. So we have this theme that we see in a variety of Cook Inlet cultures about hunting as an action where the prey willingly gives itself to worthy hunters, to respectful hunters. They allowed to overpower them, right? They allowed themselves to be hunted. And then the boy loses consciousness, was taken back to his parents. He's shivering. He's sad that the bladders, which go back into the ocean, are not, that he's not allowed to go back. From his experiences, quote, people came to understand how the seals saw humans and how humans must act to please them. So again, these kind of ideas of there's boundaries between humans and animals, but they're porous boundaries, right? The sun can go see what that world is like, but the idea of a very different perspective that the seals have, and one that needs to be taken account in this sort of web of divine sociality. This fits also, continuing on with traditional Yupik spirituality. There's very much the idea of spirit-caused diseases, with shamans doing a significant part of the curing. And indeed the idea that many, if not most, illness, unless it's from a very obvious cause like breaking a bone or eating bad food, that illness was generally a factor of spiritual causes, which then raised a huge issue when, as Napoleon points out in this article, or his book that he wrote, Harold Napoleon, it raised a huge problem when Yupik people went through what elders would call the Great Death, a time when about 50% of the population died due to epidemics in the early 20th century. It was a social crisis that ended up afterwards, sort of during/afterwards, people had largely converted over to Christianity. And he attributes that, among other things, to the fact that people sort of lost confidence in a shamanic system of healing that had not given them the outcomes they would have wanted during this terrible epidemic. We can disagree or agree with Harold Napoleon on this. It's an interesting concept. And it's certainly the case, anthropologically speaking, that oftentimes when societies undergo incredible shock, as I said before, it's not uncommon for them to seek new systems of meaning. So does this mean Yupik spirituality is entirely gone in the wake of that trauma and that dramatic shift over to Christianity? And the answer, I would say again, is really not, right? As we talked about before, there are a variety of continuities between Yupik spirituality, as well as Dena'ina spirituality, and then later Alaska Native Russian Orthodox descendants, right? Who still, in a variety of ways, honor the sacredness of nature, honor the Creator, honor the water as something from the Creator, right? So there are themes that carry over, even if there have been significant differences as well. And so we ought not to think that this is as simple as one category or the other, but recognize that the religious diversity of Cook Inlet is always evolving and shifting and changing, in part because of the complex interplays between these different belief systems that matter so greatly to people. And that's my lecture. So, in conclusion, as we would with any other type of cultural diversity, be thoughtful and observant and reflective about the different types of spiritual diversity you see around us, and let's make sure it's a Cook Inlet that people, Tikatnu, that we can have a respectful community within. All right, thank you so much.